My son didn't invite me to Christmas dinner. He told me straight over the phone, "Dad, your work is an embarrassment." I didn't argue, I just hung up. Then I put on my hazmat suit and spent the entire Christmas Eve working, while my son sat at his wealthy in-laws' lavish table pouring wine and talking about a father who didn't exist. 3 days after that, he switched on the television for the whole family, and there I was on the screen. My son called me on Christmas Eve to tell me not to come. He said my work was an embarrassment. Those were his exact words, and I have had a long time to sit with them now. So I want to be careful to give them to you honestly. The way they landed, not the way I wish they had. I was sitting in the front passenger seat of one of my company trucks when that call came through. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, a place for stories about dignity, family, and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. If this is your first time here, I'd be glad to have you stay. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell me, do you think a man like this ever really stopped believing in his son? A small note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of telling it well, and any resemblance to specific real people or places is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. Hank Braddock had the wheel. 19 years he'd been driving for Hartley Environmental Services, and the man says more with the set of his jaw than most people manage with full sentences. Devin's name came up on my screen, and Hank's hands just settled a little tighter on the rim eyes, straight ahead on the I-90 expressway, giving me the only thing he could give me, which was the illusion of being alone. I picked up on the second ring. "Dad?" There was a rehearsed quality to Devin's voice. I knew that particular tension. He'd been loading the words before he dialed. I first heard that voice when he was 15 and angling for a midnight curfew. "I need to talk to you about tomorrow." "Go ahead," I told him. "The whole family's coming. It's a formal dinner, Mom's good china, the works. Philip Aldrich is the type who digs into everything." A beat of silence. "I think it's better if you don't come to this one." Beyond the glass highway lights were strobing past in the dark. Snow had begun, not the heavy kind, just a fine, dry scatter that drifted without landing, suspended undecided. I said the words back to him. "Don't come." "You know what I'm saying?" I did. That was exactly the problem. "Devin," I said, and I kept my voice the way I'd trained it over 3 decades of working alongside people in bad situations. Steady, unremarkable. "I haven't missed one of your Christmas dinners in your entire life." "I know, Dad, but this crowd is different. These people matter." On his end, I heard the clink of ice in a glass. He was already in the role. "Her mother's on 3 non-profit boards. When someone asks what my father does, I need an answer that lands right. And what I do, I told him, is an answer that doesn't. 4 seconds of quiet. I know, because I counted every one. "Come on, Dad. Hazardous waste, industrial cleanup. I'm not telling you to be embarrassed by it. I'm saying it doesn't travel well in that room." Then, after a shorter pause, "Your work is an embarrassment. Not personally, I need you to understand that. But given the setting, given who's there, it just doesn't belong." Hank's jaw moved a fraction to the left. Nothing else. I dropped my eyes to my own hands. There's a scar on the knuckle of my right thumb, chemical burn from a job in Dorchester. 11 years back, a factory fire that put 60 men and women out of a workplace overnight. 3 weeks we spent on that remediation. I was on the ground with my crew the whole time. The scar had never been something I thought about. It wasn't something I thought about now either, but I looked at it. "All right, Devin," I said. "I knew you'd get it. You always do." The relief came off him in a wave, the particular relief of someone who has slipped past a hard conversation without actually having it. "I'll reach out after the new year. We'll make a plan, just us. That steakhouse over in Somerville, you like that place." "Sure," I said. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Merry Christmas, son." I hit the red button and laid the phone face down on my knee. Outside, the snow kept at its slow, uncommitted work. Hank let the quiet stretch. Then, "Want me to find somewhere to pull over?" "No," I said. "Keep going." And he did. Before this story moves forward, I want to say something about Hank Braddock because his place in it is larger than he realizes. Hank is 63. He came on board back when Hartley Environmental was 4 trucks and a prayer, in the years when my wife Loretta was still with us, still sitting at our kitchen table every Sunday evening, black coffee at her elbow, red pen in hand working through the numbers. He's got a daughter finishing nursing school up in Concord and a knee that's been bad for years, which he will not have examined, because he holds a firm distrust of any doctor who's never worked with his hands. Best driver I've ever put behind a wheel. His one standing rule, whatever gets said in the cab, does not leave the cab. What neither Hank nor I knew at that moment was that the truck's automatic dispatch recorder had been capturing everything. My words. Devin's words. All of it. Every vehicle running under active dispatch logs its communications. It's a liability requirement under Federal Environmental Response Protocol standard across the industry. That 43 seconds of recorded audio would end up being the most consequential thing in my son's life. We didn't know that yet. 7 minutes later, a different number came through. A broker named Stu, someone I'd used twice before, a man who never called during business hours, because by the time he called, it was already past the point where email would do. Vernon. No hello. Emergency response. Industrial site, Southern New Hampshire. Class 2 chemical spill. Client's confidential at this stage. Full crew tonight. I looked out at the highway. The snow was coming down heavier now. I asked how many people were on site. 800 on the overnight, Stu said. They've been cleared to the parking structure. It's cold out there. I held that picture in my mind. 800 people in a concrete garage on Christmas Eve, waiting in the cold, because something in their building had gone wrong. 90 minutes, I said. We'll be there. Hank didn't need to be told twice. He was already moving left, already building speed, unhurried, exact the way he always drives, like a man with a clear destination and no doubts about the route. I slipped the phone into my jacket and felt as I always do, the small folded square of cloth I've carried every working day for 6 years. Loretta's handkerchief white cotton, monogrammed with an L in green thread, she had stitched herself one winter when she couldn't sleep. We came off the highway 20 minutes later, and my son left my thoughts. He believed I drove a garbage truck. Let me be precise about what I actually drove. The first piece of equipment Hartley Environmental Services ever owned was a 1985 International vacuum tanker that Loretta and I bought at a repo auction in Worcester for $4,200. Cracked side mirror, a heater that functioned on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and had its own opinion about the rest of the week. A smell no industrial degreaser ever fully argued it out of. Loretta named it Stu after her uncle, a man she claimed also made a great deal of noise and still managed to get things done. For 2 solid years, that machine went to every job we had. Just the two of us trading the overnight runs, because a second employee wasn't something we could afford yet. And because Loretta carried the kind of conviction, hard-edged inherited from watching her own father run a hardware business into the ground on bad debt that you don't build anything worth having unless you put your hands on every part of it. She handled the books. I worked the hoses. Sunday nights she'd lay the invoices out across our kitchen table in Somerville and move through them methodically, red pen, black coffee, nothing wasted. I'd sit opposite and watch her, and think not for the first time, not for the last, that I had somehow ended up married to the most capable person I had ever known. Devin was 7 when we got Stu. Summer jobs he'd come along wedged in the back with a juice box and some handheld game checking every 20 minutes whether we were finished yet. The work held no interest for him. That's not unusual at 7. I never counted it against him. What took me longer to see was that the disinterest never left. By the time Devin reached high school, Loretta and I were running 4 trucks. By graduation at 22 and a small office in East Cambridge with a dispatcher named Arturo, who put in 18 years before retiring last spring. By the time Devin went to work at the investment bank in downtown Boston, Hartley Environmental carried 140 employees, hazardous waste certifications across 3 states, and a Massport contract that generated more revenue in a single quarter than my father saw in a lifetime of work. Devin knew none of it. Not because I kept it from him, because he never once asked. There's a specific variety of not asking that isn't the same as ignorance. It is the silence of someone who has already judged the answer unworthy of their attention. I'd watched it form over years the way damage forms in a structure, a hairline you dismiss until the day you can't look away from it. Dinners where the subject of my work was quietly redirected. Introductions at his university functions where he'd describe me as being in waste management, flat final a door being shut. Christmas cards he mailed to friends that listed both his parents' professions with my line left empty. Loretta saw it before I let myself see it. She had that habit always first. He's ashamed of you. she said to me one evening, roughly 4 years before she got sick. We were out on the back porch that October, and she delivered it the way she delivered most difficult things. Quietly, no performance, like someone reading a number off a gauge. "He's ashamed of you. He's young," I said. "He's 24, she said. "And he introduced you to his girlfriend last week as a consultant." I had nothing to say to that. So I did what I have always done with the things I can't immediately fix. I went back to work. Loretta died of a cardiac event on a Wednesday morning in March, 6 years ago. She was 54 years old. She'd been tired for 2 weeks and had a doctor's appointment set for the Monday after. She never got there. I was on a job site in Quincy when Eddie Reyes called me, and I want to say something about Eddie because he belongs in this story. Eddie came on as a field technician, 17 years ago, 22 years old, out of Dorchester, holding a chemical safety certificate and a pair of steel-toed boots he had saved 6 months to buy. Today he is my chief operating officer. He is the only person apart from Loretta who has ever told me something I didn't want to hear and turned out to be right every single time. When Eddie called that Wednesday, he didn't say much over the phone. Just, "Vernon, I'm on my way to you right now. Don't get behind the wheel." He drove 40 minutes across 2 boroughs and stood beside me in a parking lot in Quincy while I tried to take in something that couldn't be taken in all at once. That was 6 years ago. He still calls me Vernon. I still sign his paychecks. There are relationships that don't require a label. After Loretta died, I kept the handkerchief she'd had in her coat pocket that morning. White cotton and L, embroidered at the corner, in green thread her own, stitching hand done, and slightly uneven the way handmade things are. I put it in the left breast pocket of whatever jacket I wear to work. Every morning, every job. I am not a superstitious man, but I believe in carrying the people who built you into the places that demand something of you. Devin did not come to see me in the weeks after Loretta passed. He sent flowers and a card, "Thinking of you, Dad," in his careful handwriting, and he called twice. Neither call ran past 8 minutes. I'm not recounting this to stir up anger on my behalf. I'm recounting it because you need to understand what kind of silence I had already accepted long before Christmas Eve, so that when my son told me my work was an embarrassment, you'll know exactly how long that word had been sitting between us, waiting for someone to finally give it air. Hank eased down the exit ramp at a steady 30 tmorf, both hands on the wheel. Through the windshield, the sky above the industrial park had that low orange glow the color clouds go when something in the vicinity has gone wrong. My phone buzzed. A text from Eddie on site. "Waiting on you. Brought the full crew." I typed back 2 words. 2 minutes. I refolded Loretta's handkerchief along its crease and slipped it back into my pocket. Then Hank pulled through the gate, and I stepped out of the truck and I went to work. In 30 years of emergency response, I have never once declined a call because of what the calendar said. Not Thanksgiving, not the 4th of July, not the February morning my brother got married. In Providence, I missed the ceremony because a transformer fire in the meatpacking district needed a hazmat crew by 6 a.m. Loretta never once complained about that. She used to say that a man who only shows up when it suits him isn't really showing up at all. Eddie was standing at the site entrance when Hank came through the gate wearing his work jacket with the Hartley Environmental logo across the chest and holding a clipboard the way he always does, like whatever is on it could break either way. He's a compact man, Eddie built low and solid with the kind of forearms that come from years of actual physical labor rather than a gym. When he spotted me climbing down from the truck, he walked over no hurry, which told me things were serious but not yet at the edge. "Talk to me," I said. "Class 2 release," he said, passing me the incident sheet. "Chemical solvent industrial grade. Storage tank seal failed sometime around 9 tonight. The night shift manager caught it early, shut down the ventilation, and got everyone out to the parking structure." He gestured toward a concrete garage roughly 200 YD to our left, where I could make out clusters of people under fluorescent lights. 812 workers. 3 hours they'd been standing out there. 3 hours in December in New Hampshire. I looked at that structure and thought about 812 people on cold concrete because a single seal had given out and nobody had a ready response crew on contract. "What's the solvent?" I asked. "Methylene chloride, mainly. Some acetone from an adjacent line." He tapped the sheet. "Listed hazardous waste under RCRA F is Rougeau 2 designation. Vapor concentration on the main production floor is running at 4 times the permissible exposure limit under OSHA thresholds. full respiratory protection, required buddy system mandatory. I've already gone through it with the crew. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which most people have never encountered, and which is the law that governs how companies in this country manage hazardous materials, sets out specific requirements for precisely this type of event. A Class 2 incident means the contamination hasn't spread beyond the immediate site, but it presents a credible health risk to anyone exposed. It requires a licensed contractor, documented chain of custody on all recovered material, and a post-incident report, filed with the state environmental agency within 72 hours. We had worked through more than 40 Class 2 incidents over the previous decade. My crew knew those protocols the way a seasoned carpenter knows which tool to reach for without glancing at the bench. "Who's the client?" I asked. Eddie looked at the clipboard, still listed as confidential. Stu routed it through a broker. "Contract code is Project Orchard." He gave a small shrug. "Payment terms are clean, documentation's solid, legal signed off at 8:30. I looked at the name on the sheet. Project Orchard. Nothing. In this line of work, large companies frequently run emergency contracts through intermediaries, specifically to keep their name clear of an incident while they work out how to manage the story. A chemical release at an active production facility is not what a corporation wants in the news before they've had a chance to frame it properly. I understood the practice. I had no issue with it. My job wasn't to know whose plant I was cleaning. My job was to clean it. "Full crew?" I asked. 41 on site, Eddie said. "Another 8 coming in from the Roxbury depot should be here inside the hour. Get the Roxbury crew on secondary containment along the east perimeter first. I want vapor readings every 15 minutes, logged by name. Anything spikes above 6 times permissible exposure, we pull back and regroup. Nobody plays hero tonight." Already in the brief, Eddie said, "That is the thing about a crew that has operated together for years. Half the instructions never need to be spoken. They've been absorbed already the way habits become instinct, the way a good team falls into rhythm without thinking about it." I shrugged on my jacket, the heavy canvas one, with the reflective strips, and zipped it to the throat. Hank appeared at my elbow, hard hat in hand. No words, and then moved off to help with equipment. I moved Loretta's handkerchief from my jacket pocket to the inside breast pocket of my work coat, rather than leaving it in the truck. Some nights, you want the things that matter right next to you. As we headed toward the main entrance, Eddie fell in beside me. "You hear from Devin today?" he asked. Eddie is the only person outside my family who uses my son's first name. "He's earned that right," briefly I said. Eddie gave one slow nod and let it go. "That too is something you earn over 17 years. We reached the main entrance. Through the reinforced glass panels, I could see the production floor, dim and hazy, the emergency lighting, spreading a yellowish, half-dark across everything. Somewhere behind those panels, a failed seal had taken a routine Christmas Eve and turned it into something 800 people would carry with them for the rest of their lives. I let myself sit with that for a moment, how fast ordinary circumstances become extraordinary ones. How a seal no bigger than a man's hand can sit inside a tank for years without complaint, and then one particular night decide it's done. Then Eddie handed me my respirator. I put it on and stopped thinking about seals. "Let's get these people home," I said. Eddie pulled open the door. The smell reached me before my eyes had time to adjust. Methylene chloride carries a particular smell, sweet and sharp, together the way you'd imagine a chemical trying to pass itself off as something benign. Even filtered through the respirator, a ghost of it came through the kind of signal the body registers before the mind has processed it. I'd been around it enough times to know precisely what that ghost was telling me. The seal failure was worse than the first report had indicated. The production floor was vast, maybe 2 football fields end-to-end ceiling girders running 30 FTI up, and the kind of flat industrial lighting designed around output rather than atmosphere. Rows of stainless steel processing equipment ran toward the far wall. Along the east side stood 2 large storage tanks connected by a network of pipes and valves. One of those tanks had a dark wet streak down its flank, still seeping against the steel. Eddie pointed toward the east wall. "Containment berms are set, vapor monitors at 4 positions. Southeast corner is reading highest 6.2 times permissible exposure." "Who's on southeast?" I asked. "Carlos's team." Carlos Vega had been with Hartley Environmental for 8 years. He was 37 years old, Built the way a man gets when he's done physical work his entire adult life, because he had 3 children under 10, a mortgage on a house in Somerville, Massachusetts that I had personally co-signed when his bank declined him 2 years prior because his credit file had a gap from a stretch when he was between jobs doing everything right and still coming up short. That is something that happens in this country and doesn't get discussed enough. A man does everything correctly, and the paperwork still says no. I found Carlos near the southeast tank with 4 members of his team, all in full personal protective equipment, which under OSHA regulations for hazardous chemical exposure means level B protection, at minimum encapsulated suits, supplied air respirators, chemical-resistant gloves, and boots. They moved with the careful, deliberate pace of people who understand that hurrying and carelessness are the same error wearing different clothes. Carlos raised his chin when he spotted me, the greeting of a man whose hands are full. Tank 2 seal is a complete circumferential failure. The entire ring gasket went. We're looking at roughly 40 gallons released into secondary containment, but the vapor is the real problem. Secondary containment holding, he said, but it needs to be pumped before we can get anywhere near the primary valve to isolate the line. Get Reyes on the pump setup. I want that containment cleared in 90 minutes. Carlos nodded and turned back to his crew, passing instructions in the clipped shorthand of people who've worked side by side long enough that full sentences aren't necessary. I watched him for a moment, the way he moved through the hazard with complete focus and no wasted motion. And I thought about the bank that had turned this man down. I was still thinking about it when someone said my name behind me. Mr. Hartley. I turned. A woman in a state agency jacket stood at the edge of the work zone with an air quality monitor and a tablet. She was perhaps 55, close-cropped gray hair, the kind of direct eye contact that belongs to someone who has spent a career in rooms where things have gone wrong. Dr. Paula Renner, she said, extending her hand. New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm the on-call toxicologist for tonight's incident response. She had a firm handshake and held it a full second, which I have always taken as a sign of someone at ease with accountability. I've been following your company's work for about 2 years. I'm glad you're the crew on this one. What's the state's assessment? I asked. Vapor concentration is falling in the northern 2/3 of the floor since your team set the ventilation reversal. Southeast is still elevated as your man there told you. She glanced toward Carlos. The good news is secondary containment is intact. We're not looking at soil penetration. The bad news is you have 800 workers who need a written clearance from my office before re-entry, and I can't issue that until readings come down to below 1.5 times permissible exposure at all 4 monitor points. How long? She consulted her tablet. At the current rate, 4 to 5 hours, assuming no further release from the primary line. 4 to 5 hours, which meant those 800 people in the parking structure were going to be standing on concrete until somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve. Is there a break room or cafeteria in the parking structure? I asked. Dr. Renner looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately place. I don't know, she said. Why? Because 800 people have been on their feet for 3 hours and it's 31 degrees outside and I want to know if they have somewhere to sit down. She blinked. Then she said, I'll find out, and headed for the exit with her tablet. Eddie appeared at my shoulder. I called the diner on Route 3, he said. They're open late. I ordered coffee and hot soup for the parking structure coming out of petty cash. I looked at him. Loretta would have done it, he said simply. He was right. She absolutely would have. We worked through the rest of the night in the steady rhythm of a crew that knows its trade. Vapor readings every 15 minutes logged by the team member responsible as I'd instructed. Pump operations on the secondary containment. Isolation of the primary supply valve on Tank 2 once the containment was clear. Documentation running alongside every physical step, because in federal hazardous waste response, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. At 1:47 in the morning, Dr. Renner walked back onto the production floor and checked the southeast monitor. 1.3, she said. She looked up, and for the first time all night, something in her face eased. Not a smile, more the expression of a professional who has been holding things tight for hours and has just been given permission to let go. I can issue the clearance, she said. I pulled out my phone and texted Eddie 2 words. Tell them. 4 minutes later, from somewhere out in the parking structure, I heard it. A sound I have heard maybe a dozen times across 30 years of this work and which never loses its meaning. The sound of 800 people beginning to move at once. I learned what had happened at that dinner table 3 days later. In pieces. That's how bad news arrives, never all at once, always in the sequence that does the most damage. Paige Aldrich was the one who told me. She called late on the night of the 27th after everything had settled and she'd finally slipped away from the apartment. She talked for a long time, and her memory for detail turned out to be the kind you don't expect from someone her age, precise, sequential, like a person who had spent the evening watching rather than performing. I'll give it to you the way she gave it to me because she earned the right to tell it. The Aldrich apartment occupied the entire 14th floor of a pre-war building on Commonwealth Avenue, the kind of address that doesn't announce itself, because everyone in the relevant circles already knows what it means. Philip Aldrich had inherited the apartment from his father and renovated it twice, most recently 4 years ago, when he had the kitchen redesigned around a commercial range that cost more than my first truck. Sylvia Aldrich had filled it with things that were beautiful, without being demonstrative, the particular aesthetic of people who have been comfortable long enough to stop proving it. Devin had been there since noon, helping Sylvia arrange the centerpiece, which Paige told me he did with the concentrated enthusiasm of a man auditioning for a part he badly wanted. He wore a blazer she hadn't seen on him before. He'd had his hair cut the previous morning. Devin had brought a bottle of scotch selected by someone at his office who knew about scotch. And he presented it to Philip with both hands and a short account of the distillery that Philip received with the patient expression of a man who has been given spirit explanations by eager young men for 30 years. Philip Aldrich was 61 years old and had built Aldrich Pharmaceutical Group. Paige offered the company name without hesitation, the way people say names they've grown up hearing as established fact, rather than information from a regional manufacturer into a national distributor over 25 years of decisions that he made according to Paige by trusting his read on people rather than their presentations. He was tall with the unhurried posture of someone who stopped needing to impress anyone a long time ago. And he had the kind of handshake Paige said that told you right away whether a man was at ease with himself. Sylvia was 58, silver-haired, and managed 3 charitable foundations, with the kind of organizational precision you'd expect from a military logistics operation. Paige told me she missed nothing and forgot nothing. She had a private habit of pulling out her phone to capture things she wanted to hold on to, quietly without drawing attention. That habit would turn out to matter. Food came to the table at 7. The china was Sylvia's grandmother's crystal that broke the candlelight into small prismatic arcs across the pressed linen, a table that by any honest measure was stunning. Devin sat looking at it with the expression of a man who has finally reached somewhere he spent a long time aiming for. The first stretch of the evening ran exactly as he needed it to. Philip asked about the bank, and Devin moved through his prepared answer portfolio strategy emerging markets with the smoothness of someone whose delivery has been worn so smooth by repetition, it no longer sounds like a script. Sylvia raised the wedding date, and Devin said Spring and Paige said nothing was settled yet, and Sylvia smiled at the space between those two answers in a way Paige described as precise rather than cruel. Then Philip put down his fork and steered the conversation somewhere Devin hadn't mapped out. Something quite extraordinary happened to us this week, Philip said, with the tone of a man who has decided to say something true. Our facility in New Hampshire, chemical release Christmas Eve, a serious incident, and the crew they sent in. He let it sit for a moment, shaking his head slowly. 30 years I've been running operations. I have never watched a team work the way those people worked. Disciplined, methodical, completely professional. And the man in charge, Philip lifted his glass. You could see in his hands that he'd done physical labor his entire life, scarred, roughened. But his eyes, he paused. His eyes were the calmest I have ever encountered on a job site. Devin nodded along. Good to hear, he said. The site foreman told us afterward that the company's owner had come personally. Philip continued. Christmas Eve, running the job himself. He looked around at the table. You never see that from the larger outfits. They dispatch a manager. This man came himself. Honestly, Devin said, turning his glass lightly in his fingers, settled now, back on familiar ground. Those contractors, they respond because someone is paying them to. It's a business transaction. I'd be careful reading any deeper meaning into it. Philip held his gaze on Devin for a beat without replying. Not hostility. Assessment. Perhaps, Philip said. Then he turned toward Sylvia. The centerpiece is just beautiful, darling. Sylvia smiled and lifted her phone. Quickly, almost reflexively, she took 2 shots of the table from slightly different angles, then placed the phone screen down beside her plate. She didn't realize Paige told me this, that the screen had also captured the timestamp on a recent message and a group chat alert. That image would become significant 3 days later. Sylvia had no way of knowing that. I had no way of knowing it either. What Devin did next is the moment Paige's account lodged deepest in me. He lifted his glass toward Philip and spoke with warmth and absolute conviction. "To the people who keep things running," he said, "whoever they are." Philip raised his glass in return. My son and his future father-in-law, at a table I'd been told to stay away from, drinking to an unnamed stranger who turned out to be me. And sitting somewhere on that same table, wrapped in silver paper, with a card in Devin's handwriting, was a gift addressed to the anonymous man who had saved the Aldrich facility. That gift was already making its way to my office. Paige said the evening wound down easily after that. Devin stayed to help with the dishes. He kissed Sylvia on the cheek at the front door. He told Philip the evening had been an honor. Riding home in the car, Paige told me he was singing with the radio. After the workers filed back inside, the work that doesn't get talked about began. People tend to assume that emergency response wraps up when the hazard is neutralized. It doesn't. It wraps up when every recovered gallon has been entered into the log, when every surface reading has a record attached to it, when every piece of contaminated gear has been bagged, labeled, and tied to a federal manifest, and every crew member has signed their personal exposure documentation for the night. That isn't red tape. It's a shield for the workers, for whoever hired us, and for the people who suited up and walked toward the problem, while 800 others waited in the cold. We completed the primary paperwork at 4:17 in the morning. Carlos dropped onto an equipment case near the south entrance and worked off his respirator. The seal had left deep red lines across his face, and despite the December temperature, he'd soaked through his undershirt. He had the look of someone who had spent everything the situation required and arrived on the other side of it empty. "My daughter asked me this morning what I wanted for Christmas." He said not to anyone specifically. "I told her I wanted my whole crew walking out the door at the end of the shift." He kept his eyes on the floor, and after a moment his jaw tightened, not in anger, in something harder to name. 812 people, boss. That's 812 families waking up to Christmas morning. Something shifted in my throat that I hadn't been prepared for. I tilted my head back and stared up at the girders crossing the ceiling overhead, watching the lights come back on in sections as the ventilation system pushed the last of the vapor out. "Go home, Carlos," I said. "Your kids are waiting." He got to his feet, gave one nod, and moved toward the exit without a glance back. That's always been one of the things I respect most about Carlos Vega. He has a sense of when a moment has run its course. Eddie tracked me down 20 minutes later beside Tank 2, standing with a cold coffee and a clipboard I'd stopped actually reading. He swapped it for a hot cup from the thermos Hank had kept in the truck, and we stood there together for a while, saying nothing, which with Eddie carries its own weight. Silence between two people who have worked enough hard nights side by side isn't emptiness. It's a different kind of conversation. "You got a call from Devin today," he said at last. Not a question. "He rang to say don't come to Christmas dinner," I told him. Eddie cradled his cup in both hands. Steam lifted between us from the cold air rolling in through the open loading dock. He was quiet a long time, and when he spoke, the words came out slowly and with care, the way Eddie always does, when he's weighing what he actually wants to say against what he thinks he should. "Loretta used to say," he began, "that the hardest part of loving someone who sees you wrong is that you can't fix their vision. All you can do is stay exactly who you are and give them enough time to find the right angle." I held his eye. "She said that about you, by the way," he added, "back in the early years when your father kept referring to the whole thing as your little hobby." Something almost like a smile crossed his face. "She had a lot of patience, Loretta." "She did," I said. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out the handkerchief. I'd used it twice through the night, once to clear a chemical smear from my safety glasses, and once for a reason I'd describe as less professional. That was around 2:04 in the morning, near the east wall, when Carlos's words about 812 families found the one spot I hadn't thought to protect. The cotton was warm from sitting against me all night, softened at the creases. The green L in the corner had started to lose definition at its edges. Years of washing will do that. I folded it back along the same crease Loretta always used and tucked it away. She'd have gotten something out of tonight, I said. Eddie nodded slowly. She'd have sent out more soup. Hank materialized at the dock entrance keys, out jaw set at its usual angle, giving nothing away. Trucks are loaded, he said. Roxbury crew's already moving. We heading out? I stood looking at Tank 2 one more time. The streak on its flank had dried to nothing. The containment basin was pumped clean. The floor was lit and quiet and waiting for the morning crew to walk back through in a few hours, which they would because people do. They always come back. They keep showing up. Yeah, I said. Let's go home. Out beyond the building, the sky above New Hampshire was shifting black thinning into that particular deep blue that appears just before morning, when the night has finished its work, but the day hasn't yet arrived. Hank turned the key. The cab's warmth wrapped around me the moment I climbed in. 3 missed calls on my phone, every one of them, Devin. I tucked it into my jacket pocket alongside Loretta's handkerchief and shut my eyes. Loretta was the one who taught me to read the name before the numbers. The first time we ever put our signatures on a commercial contract. Hartley Environmental was barely 14 months old, and we had the document spread across the kitchen table, more money printed on those pages than we had ever personally guaranteed. I went straight for the payment schedule. Loretta placed 2 fingers on my wrist. No drama, no preamble, just the quiet directness she used for the things that actually counted. Read the name first, she said. You should always know whose hand you're shaking. That lesson never left me. Name first, numbers second, every contract, every invoice, every purchase order, without exception. I was behind my desk on the morning of December 26th when Brett Colby's email landed. Brett Colby served as director of communications for the company I had spent the previous 48 hours working. The email carried the formal client disclosure package, the one the broker had held in reserve until the emergency response was fully wrapped. That was standard procedure for incidents of this sensitivity. I had accepted those terms in the engagement letter and hadn't revisited them until that email appeared on my screen. I clicked the attachment open. 4 pages of standard vendor onboarding material, the sort of paperwork Gloria could process without breaking stride. I turned to the signature page the way Loretta had shown me. There at the top, set in navy blue above the corporate seal, Aldrich Pharmaceutical Group. I read the name a second time. Then I put the document flat on my desk and looked through the window toward the yard where 2 of my trucks were taking on their loads for the morning. The drivers moved with the easy precision of men who already know every turn of the route. Aldrich Pharmaceutical Group. Philip Aldrich, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. The same man who had been seated across a dinner table from me the prior evening and remarked that the owner of the company working his facility had the steadiest eyes he'd ever encountered on a job site. The man whose daughter wore my son's ring. Gloria Fenwick tapped once and walked in without pausing for an answer. 15 years earns you that. She is a trim woman somewhere in her mid-40s, her reading glasses habitually parked on her forehead until she has genuine use for them. She possesses a gift, and I have never found a satisfying explanation for it, of entering a room at the precise instant she is required. You've seen the disclosure, she said, not a question. Just now, I said. She pulled the chair across from my desk and settled her hands in her lap. The moment Brett Colby's name came through last night, I traced the connection. Aldrich Pharmaceutical, Devin's fiancé's family. A pause. I didn't want you walking into it cold. Are we looking at a conflict? Gloria came to me after 11 years as a corporate accountant. She reads the structure of business relationships the way an engineer reads the bones of a building load by load. She weighed her answer before she gave it. Legally speaking, a conflict of interest demands a financial entanglement or a duty pulling in 2 directions, she said. The fact that your son is engaged to the client's daughter is a family matter. No ownership overlaps, no money crossing between parties, nothing in the Aldrich contract that puts us in an opposing position. Her eyes held mine. There is no conflict, but there is a connection, and that connection needs to go on paper disclosed internally from today. Draft the email, I said. Copy Eddie, date it today. She noted it down, then lifted her eyes. What's your plan with Devin? I picked up the document again and looked at Philip Aldrich's signature. Unhurried, assured, the mark of a man long accustomed to signing things that matter. My mind went to those 3 missed calls in my pocket on the ride back. Then to Devin on Christmas Eve, already installed in the Aldrich apartment, already playing his part, telling me my line of work didn't belong in that conversation. Nothing, I said. Gloria's brows shifted a fraction. Nothing. He asked me to leave work out of it. My client asks for privacy. Both of those requests lead to the same place. I set the document aside. I'll honor what each of them asked for. She regarded me a moment with the particular look she keeps for choices she disagrees with, but has chosen not to challenge. Then the cap came off her pen. "You'll have the disclosure email in 20 minutes, she said, and rose. She was at the door when she stopped, didn't turn around. Vernon. A beat. The governor's office rang this morning, something about a recognition ceremony on the 27th. They're waiting on a call back. I looked back out at the yard. The trucks were moving out in line, one following the other, the morning run beginning through the cold streets of Somerville. Call them back, I said. Tell them yes. I want to be fair to my son. That phrase has lived with me, the question buried inside it of what fairness actually requires towards someone who wasn't fair with you. What I've come to believe is this fairness isn't the same as absolution. You can set the truth of what a person did squarely in front of them and still hold love for them in the same breath. The two aren't mutually exclusive. They only feel that way for a season. So here is what Devin did in the order I came to know it. The bulk of it surfaced in the days following December 27th, assembled from Cynthia Wexler's reporting, from Gloria's internal audit, and from what Devin himself eventually admitted. I'll tell it as plainly as I can without the weight of the anger that is no longer mine to carry, because that anger burned itself out long ago, and whatever sits beneath it is quieter and doesn't have a clean name. 8 weeks before Christmas, my son built a GoFundMe page and put my name and my face on it. The page cast me as a widower in financial distress following my wife's death. No health coverage, accumulating medical debt for an illness I do not have. He wrote it in my voice as though the words were coming directly from me. He chose a photograph from Loretta's funeral, the one where I'm standing at the graveside in my good coat, eyes lowered, because that particular image carried the fullest appearance of grief. The page collected $41,000 over 6 weeks from people all over the country who encountered the portrait of a grieving old man and gave generously because that is the instinct of people with decency when they are made to believe someone is suffering. Devin put that money toward Paige's engagement ring and the deposit on a Beacon Hill apartment. Under Massachusetts penal law, what Devin did carries a specific name. It is called grand larceny in the second degree, obtaining property through false pretenses when the amount exceeds $50,000. Because the $47,000 stopped just short of that line, the charge that actually applied was grand larceny in the third degree, a Class D felony, with a maximum sentence of 7 years. I'm not recounting this because I had any wish to see my son incarcerated. I'm recounting it because the law assigns names to things, and naming something correctly is how you honor the people. It wronged in this instance $47,000 worth of strangers who parted with their money because they believed a lie told in my name. The second thing Devin did was construct a LinkedIn profile and attach my name to it. The profile identified me as a retired senior environmental consultant. No company, no photograph, no work history listed. The calculation was transparent enough if Philip or Sylvia Aldrich entered my name into a search. Before the engagement dinner, they would pull up an account that placed me as a harmless retiree rather than the man actively running a 200-person company in Somerville. Devin had mapped this out in advance. He had made a plan. Of all the things I eventually learned, that premeditation is what took the longest to settle in my chest. The third thing was the last I discovered. And when I finally understood what it was, I needed time alone with it before I could speak it to anyone, even Eddie. Devin had filed 3 anonymous reviews of Hartley Environmental on Glassdoor, 1 star apiece. The reviews called the company a toxic environment, labeled the owner as erratic and volatile, described the working conditions as unsafe. The voice was that of a wronged employee, detailed enough to seem genuine, imprecise enough to resist any verification. They had been submitted from the IP address registered to my home network over a weekend 2 months earlier when Devin was under my roof, sleeping in the bedroom where he grew up, eating what I cooked on the Wi-Fi connection I paid for every month. The way I found out was through my IT manager, who caught the IP anomaly during a routine security audit. He brought it to Gloria, and Gloria brought it to me. When I saw that address on the report, I recognized it the way you recognize a scar on your own hand. Nobody has to explain it to you. I am not going to try to describe what moved through me in that moment. I don't believe I have the right words for it. And certain things belonged to a man alone to his kitchen and the dark pressing against the window at 11 o'clock at night. What I can tell you is that I drew Loretta's handkerchief from my jacket pocket and held it in both hands for a long while doing nothing else. Somewhere in the city that same night, a reporter named Cynthia Wexler was at her desk at the Boston Herald 2 years into an investigation of companies that do essential work while the world looks the other way. She had been following Hartley Environmental since the Massport contract. She was 3 days from filing the most significant story of her career. She didn't yet know the story had just grown considerably larger. For 4 years, I sent Devin $3,500 a month by Venmo. I never explained the money in any particular detail. The transfer notes read things like, "for you," or "just in case," or sometimes left blank entirely, because I didn't want the money to carry the weight of a transaction. I wanted it to feel like what it actually was, a father who recognized that his son was trying to build something in one of the most expensive cities in the world, and who didn't want that particular pressure to be the thing standing between Devin and the person he was working to become. Over those 4 years, the total reached $168,000. Gloria was the one who put it on paper. She did it without being asked, the way she handles most things that need handling, typed the figure in the center of a single page, and set it on my desk on the morning of December 26th without a word. I looked at it, then I turned the page face down, and we left it at that because the number wasn't the point, and we both understood that. The point was that Devin had received $168,000 from a man whose livelihood he'd called an embarrassment, and he had never once asked where it came from or what it had taken to send it. I'm not holding that up to make him a villain. I'm holding it up because it is true, and the truth of a thing is the only version that's worth preserving. The package reached my office at 2:17 in the afternoon. Hank carried it in from the front desk and placed it on the corner of my desk without any remark. A medium-sized box wrapped in silver paper white ribbon, the kind of wrapping a store does for you. A small envelope was tucked under the ribbon. I almost set it aside the way you set aside things that can wait. Then I saw the handwriting on the envelope. To the team at Project Orchard, response with gratitude. It was careful, even the penmanship of someone who had been properly taught and had never let it slip. I knew it the way you know a voice on a phone before the person announces themselves. Devin had written me birthday cards in that same hand since he was 11 years old. I have kept every one of them in the top drawer of my desk at home. Something tightened in my chest without warning, sudden and exact, like a fist closing around something that could shatter. I opened the envelope. The card was cream-colored, a simple gold border. Devin had written 4 sentences. To whoever led the response on Christmas Eve, my future father-in-law's company was in crisis, and your team showed up when it mattered most. I don't know your name, but I know what you did. This family owes you more than this small gesture can express. With sincere gratitude, Devin Hartley. I read it 3 times. Then I set it on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the surface, the way you steady yourself against something that is shifting underfoot. I stayed like that for a long while, looking at my son's handwriting on a card, written to a stranger who happened to be me. Eddie came in without knocking, took one look at my face, and stopped where he stood. "Vernon," he said. "He sent a gift," I said. "Devin, a thank you gift to the response team." Eddie crossed the room and picked up the card, read it on his feet. I watched his jaw move once, that small, tight motion he makes when something lands that he wasn't braced for. He set the card back down with care, the way you handle something breakable. "He thanked you," Eddie said quietly. "He just didn't know it was you." "No," I said. "He didn't." Outside the window, the yard was into its afternoon shift. 2 drivers were walking the perimeter of their rigs with clipboards running, pre-trip checks, tires, lights, the methodical attention of men who know that the small, careful things are what keep everyone else safe. I watched them for a time, without really taking them in. My son had written me a thank you note. 4 sentences, cream paper gold, border his careful hand. He had meant every word of it. Not one word was intended for me. I picked up the card and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, beside the birthday cards I'd been keeping since he was 11. Then I lifted Loretta's handkerchief and pressed it hard against my mouth until whatever was rising in me had passed. The ceremony was tomorrow. I still had a speech to write. Loretta bought me the suit for our 20th anniversary. We'd gone to dinner at a restaurant in downtown Boston that was a step above anywhere. We typically went the kind of establishment where the menus carry no prices on the woman's copy, which Loretta found simultaneously charming and absurd. She had worn a blue dress I hadn't seen before, and she looked so completely like herself in it that I remember watching her read the menu and thinking 20 years hasn't touched the essential thing about her. It has only brought it into sharper relief. After dinner, she steered me 2 blocks down into a men's clothing store she had obviously already scoped, because she walked directly to a rack near the back without a glance at anything else. She pulled out a charcoal gray suit in my size and held it up with the expression of a woman who has already reached her verdict and is simply waiting for the formality to conclude. "You need one good suit," she said, "for the moments that deserve it." I wore that suit to her funeral. I wore it to sign the Massport contract. I wore it the afternoon we broke ground on our second warehouse when Eddie brought champagne in plastic cups and Carlos gave a toast that reduced 3 grown men to tears in a parking lot in Somerville. It had been let out once at the waist and sent to the cleaner more times than I could count, and it still held its shape the way a well-made thing does when you've looked after it, which is to say precisely as it should. I laid it across the bed on the morning of December 27th and stood looking at it for a moment. Beyond the bedroom window, Somerville was doing what it does on a gray December morning, going about its business without ceremony. A garbage truck was working through the block. A woman was walking a dog the size of a shoebox. 2 kids in oversized coats waited at the bus stop with the particular patience of people who have come to accept that the bus arrives when it arrives. I showered and dressed slowly, the way you dress when the occasion warrants it. I knotted my tie twice. The first attempt came out crooked, and Loretta wasn't there to fix it. For 27 years, she had straightened my tie before every moment that mattered, standing close in front of me with her tongue just between her teeth, her fingers working the silk with the focused precision of a woman who understood that the small, careful things are what hold everything else in place. The second knot was straight enough. Not as straight as hers would have been, but straight enough. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a single sheet of paper, and I wrote the speech. It took 11 minutes. I don't say that to suggest it came easy. I say it because the things you have been living with for a long time do not require many words to express. The sentences were already there. They had been gathering quietly for 30 years. What I'm about to share is something I sat with alone for a long time before I could speak it out loud. It changed the way I understood certain evenings I thought I already knew by heart. Before I get there, tell me in the comments if someone you loved had been quietly working against you. Would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you let the truth find its own time? The way interest builds in an account you keep meaning to look at. What I wrote was not about me. It was about the people who would be standing next to me on that stage. Carlos and his crew, Eddie, Hank, the drivers and dock workers and lab technicians who were there before first light and still there after dark, and who never asked to be recognized, because they understand that the work itself is the recognition. I wrote about what it means to support a family by keeping other people's supply chains intact. I wrote about Loretta's conviction that honest work carries a dignity no outside authority can bestow and none can strip away. It simply is what it is. The same way a river is a river, whether anyone stands on the bank watching it or not. There was one sentence I wasn't certain I could deliver aloud until the moment I was actually at the microphone. I wrote it down regardless because Loretta always held that the sentences you're most afraid to say are generally the ones most worth saying. I folded the page twice and slipped it into the inside breast pocket of my jacket beside the place where Loretta's handkerchief lives. The two of them together, the speech and the handkerchief, made a small, steady pressure against my chest that I carried with me all morning. Eddie called at 9:15. "Car's here in 45, he said. "Carlos is bringing his kids. They want to see the governor." "How many kids?" 3, ages 4, 7, and 9. The 9-year-old has questions ready. I almost smiled. "What kind of questions?" "Apparently she wants to know if the governor has ever driven a dump truck." Eddie paused. "I told her probably not, but that your boss has, and she said that's more impressive." I did smile then, fully, the first time in 3 days. "Tell her she's right," I said. "Already did," Eddie said. "See you in 45. I hung up and stood at the kitchen window with my coffee going cold, watching the street below. The garbage truck had moved along. The woman with the small dog was gone. The 2 kids from the bus stop had been collected by whatever bus finally came. The street was quiet and ordinary, and mine, the street I had driven down every working morning for 22 years. The street Loretta and I had walked on Sunday evenings when the weather held and we had nowhere particular to be. I knew every crack square of that pavement. I knew which neighbor left their recycling bin out past collection day, and which one shoveled the walkway all the way to the corner on behalf of the elderly woman in the building next door. I knew that street the way you know, a place you've chosen rather than inherited, which is to say, I knew it in my bones. I rinsed my cup, pulled on my coat, and took my keys off the hook. At that same moment, 22 blocks uptown, and a different world, entirely, my son was pouring coffee in the Aldrich kitchen. The television in the living room was on tune to the local news. Nobody was paying it much mind yet. That was about to change. Paige told me what happened in that living room, and she told it the way she tells everything carefully in sequence without editorializing, as though the facts carry their own weight and require no commentary from her to land. She is right about that. They don't. The television had been running since morning, tuned to the local news channel, the kind that loops in Boston kitchens and living rooms, the way the weather forecast used to background noise that becomes foreground without warning. Nobody was watching it with any real attention. Devin was on his second cup. Philip was reading something on his tablet at the far end of the room. Sylvia was on the phone in the hallway. Paige was sitting near the window with a book she hadn't actually been reading for the past 20 minutes. At 2:43 in the afternoon, the channel cut away from its regular programming. The graphic that came up on screen read, "Special Live Coverage New York State Recognition Ceremony." Below that, in smaller text, "Governor Hubbard to honor community heroes, live from Concord." Devin glanced at the screen. He said to no one. He didn't reach for the remote. Philip looked up from his tablet. He had the reflexes of a man who pays close attention to government events, someone whose business runs on regulatory relationships. He set the tablet down. On screen, the ceremony was already underway. The venue was a formal hall in Concord state flags, flanking a podium rows of seated guests in the foreground. Governor Dale Hubbard was partway through his remarks, a tall man unhurried in his delivery, the kind of voice that fills a room without pressing against the walls. "Yet this state runs," the governor was saying, "because of people most of us never see. They work the hours that don't make the news. They handle the problems that never become headlines because they resolve them before that can happen." Philip Aldrich set his tablet all the way down on the side table. On Christmas Eve, Governor Hubbard continued, "A chemical release at a major production facility in southern New Hampshire put 800 workers at risk. The response that night was fast, complete, and without error. The company that led it did not wait for a government contract. They did not negotiate terms. They mobilized in under an hour and worked straight through the night." He paused. "And when the bill came due, the owner of that company instructed our office to apply the fee to the Community Remediation Fund. He charged the facility nothing." Philip stood up. It wasn't a dramatic movement. He simply rose from his chair the way a man does when something demands his full attention and his full height. Paige watched him do it and understood, before she could have explained why, that something in the room had shifted. The founder of Hartley Environmental Services, Governor Hubbard said, has operated in this state for 30 years, without recognition, without complaint, and without seeking either. Tonight we are correcting that. The camera moved to the side of the stage. Vernon Hartley walked to the podium in a charcoal gray suit, and Philip Aldrich made a sound that Paige said she had never heard her father make before. Not a word, not quite a word. The sound a man produces when something he has been carrying without realizing it suddenly becomes visible. Devin turned from the window where he had been refilling his cup. He looked at the screen. He looked at the man in the charcoal suit accepting a medal from the governor. He looked again, his coffee cup tilting in his hand. Paige watched a thin line of coffee run down the outside of the mug and drop onto the hardwood floor. Devin didn't notice. "That's," he said. He stopped. He started again. "That's my father?" No one in the room responded right away. The television filled the silence with applause from Concord. Philip turned his head toward Devin with the slow deliberateness of a man making sure he is understood correctly. His expression, Paige told me, was not anger. It was something more measured than anger. It was the look of a man reassembling information he believed he already had sorted. "Your father," Philip said, "is Vernon Hartley." It was not a question. "He runs an environmental services company," Devin said. The sentence came out emptied of everything. No framing, no context, just the bare fact placed in the room, the way you set down something you've been gripping too long. "I know what he runs," Philip said quietly. "I was at his facility on Christmas Eve. I watched his crew work for 6 hours. He looked at Devin with an expression Paige described as being precisely as heavy as it needed to be, and no heavier. I shook his hand in the parking lot at 2:00 in the morning. He had been working since before midnight. A pause. I described him to you the next day at dinner. Devin's face did something complicated. Paige said it passed through 3 or 4 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds, none of which settled into anything coherent. You said he was in shipping, Philip said. When we first met, you told me your father was in shipping. He is, Devin said. Technically. Technically, Philip repeated. On the television, Governor Hubbard was leaning toward the microphone again. His voice moved into the room the way sound does when a room has gone still enough to receive it. Mr. Hartley, the governor said, the floor is yours. Vernon stepped to the podium, and Philip Aldrich, standing in the center of his own living room, in his good clothes on a quiet December afternoon, crossed his arms over his chest and watched the man he had described just the previous evening as having the steadiest eyes he had ever encountered on a job site prepare to speak to the state of New York. Sylvia stepped into the doorway from the hall phone still in hand. What did I miss? No one answered her. Microphones are not my thing. What I love is a dock door swinging open at 4 in the morning, the low groan a truck makes settling into the bay at exactly the right angle, a manifest that adds up clean, a crew that catches your meaning before you finish the sentence, the hush that settles over a warehouse at the tail end of a long shift, that particular stillness when the work is done, and the building still carries the body heat of everyone who put in the hours. But I had written something down, and the people in that room had earned the right to hear it. I smoothed the page flat against the podium and lifted my eyes. The hall in Concord seats 400. It was full. Up front, I could pick out my people drivers, field technicians, lab, staff men and women who had made the trip from Somerville and Roxbury and Quincy on a gray December afternoon because Eddie had fired off one text. The governor wants to say, thank you, and you all earned it. Carlos was in the second row with his 3 kids. The 9-year-old, whose name is Mila, sat with her spine perfectly straight, a small notebook open on her knee. That image alone made the whole day worthwhile. Before pulling out the speech, my hand found, as it always does, the folded square of cotton already sitting in that pocket. I left Loretta's handkerchief where it was and drew out the page instead. I'll be brief. I said, because the people sharing this stage with me have been on their feet since Christmas Eve, and they've earned the chance to sit down. The laughter that came back was real, the kind that means people recognize something true, not the kind that means they were being polite. It's not companies that move hazardous materials, I said. It's people. Our drivers haul the weight of this state's industrial supply chain through 6 months of brutal weather and traffic and broken equipment and emergencies that come in at 3 in the morning. I'd rather you walk out of here knowing their names than mine. I looked out at my crew. Carlos Vega has worked for Hartley Environmental for 8 years. On Christmas Eve, he spent 6 hours in full protective gear inside a structure that wasn't fit to breathe in. When the job was finished, the first words out of his mouth were that 8 out of 12 families got to wake up to Christmas morning. That is what this company is built on, not the fleet, not the contracts. The applause started and I raised a hand not to cut it off, but to hold the space long enough to finish. My wife built this company alongside me, I said. Her name was Loretta. Sunday nights she ran the books at our kitchen table. She drove second shift when a third hire wasn't in the budget. And she was certain without any evidence yet to back it up that the work we were doing had meaning. A pause. She was right. Honest work carries its own weight. It doesn't require a title. It doesn't require a room watching. It doesn't have to be the sort of thing that comes up over dinner at the right address. The sentence that followed was the one I'd wrestled with all morning, the one I had almost left on the kitchen table. But I was standing at a podium in Concord and the sweet Loretta had chosen with her handkerchief pressed against my chest, and the uncertain sentence happened to be the honest one. There is no work that is beneath a person's dignity. The only thing beneath a person's dignity is to look at someone doing honest work and conclude that it diminishes you. I folded the page. What came after was a long wave of applause, and I stood inside it with my mind somewhere else entirely. A Sunday kitchen, a red pen moving down a column of figures, a cup of black coffee going cold. I didn't cry. But the margin was narrow, and I have no interest in pretending otherwise. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around Loretta's handkerchief. I didn't unfold it. I held it at my side in my left hand while the room ran its course. Governor Hubbard gripped my hand and said something I didn't catch because my attention had drifted back to Mila in the second row, head bent over her notebook, writing with the urgent concentration of a 9-year-old who is determined that something must be recorded. 22 miles south in a living room on Commonwealth Avenue, Paige Aldrich was watching my son receive that last sentence. She told me afterward that his face didn't come apart. No crumbling, no collapse, none of the theatrical grief you see in films. What happened was slower and went deeper. She described it as the expression of someone who has just absorbed a thing they will never be free of, a man who understood, in the bone-deep way of actual recognition, that the words had been aimed at him, even though his name was nowhere in them. Even though the man at the podium hadn't glanced at a camera or let a dramatic pause land. He had just said a true thing and folded his paper. Devin set his coffee cup down on the table, both hands this time, carefully. Philip hadn't shifted from his spot, arms folded, eyes on the screen. When the applause in Concord began winding down, he turned toward his future son-in-law. Paige told me it was the same look her father brought to board meetings when something said in the room had just redrawn the map, everyone present feeling it, nobody yet willing to be the first to speak. Sylvia was seated by then. She'd assembled the shape of what she'd missed from the texture of the silence, and now she was watching her daughter watch Devin with the quiet attentiveness of a mother who has been reading her child long enough to know when something real is happening to her. Paige said she kept her eyes on Devin for a long stretch without a word. Then Philip's phone buzzed against the side table. He looked at the screen, read it a second time. "Excuse me," he said to the room in general, to no one in particular, and walked out carrying the phone flat against his chest, the way a man transports something he isn't ready to put into words yet. Devin watched him leave. The television ran on. The Concord ceremony was in its final minutes, camera pulling wide across the stage rows of crew members, the governor at the lectern. Somewhere in the background of one shot, Vernon was visible mid-conversation with Carlos, gesturing at something off-frame, already operating as a man with the next task in mind, rather than one who had just been handed a medal. Philip Aldrich was out of the room for 11 minutes. Paige tracked it, checked the time when he left, checked again when he returned. Not impatience. The watchfulness of someone raised in a home where the emotional weather was set by the adults and where learning to read the small signs early was simply how you stayed oriented. 11 minutes. The angle of the phone going out. The empty hand coming back in. He re-entered the living room and stopped just inside the doorway, hands settled in his pockets. Paige told me that was her father's posture for having finished with something as distinct from the crossed arms of a man who was still inside it. The arms were down. That was the signal. Devin hadn't moved from the couch. The television was muted but still going. The closing footage from Concord played without sound, the hall emptying, the crews moving toward the exits, the governor working his way through handshakes. In the background of one frame, Vernon was there talking with Carlos, pointing at something beyond the camera, back to being a working man rather than an honoree. "Devin," Philip said, quietly. It was enough. Devin looked up. "I have some questions for you," Philip said. "Before I ask them, I want to be clear this isn't anger. What I need is accurate information, and 30 years of running a company has taught me that the time to gather it is before it becomes urgent, not after." Devin gave a nod. He had arranged his face the way Paige said he did when he felt the situation beginning to tilt, composed, focused body, angled slightly forward, the look of a man who still believes the conversation is something he can steer. "This afternoon my attorney ran a background check on Hartley Environmental Services," Philip said. "Standard due diligence, the same review we conduct on any prospective long-term partner. He sent me the findings while I was out of the room." A pause. "Are you aware that Hartley Environmental Holdings, LLC, holds approximately 30% of the equity in the investment bank where you are currently employed?" The professional expression didn't fall off Devin's face. It dissolved slowly the way ice goes rather than shatters the structure, hanging there a moment after the substance has left it. Devin said. He stopped. "I knew my father had some investments. I didn't know the specifics." 30%, Philip said again, as though the figure were a fixed point in a room that had started to move. "That is not a passive holding, Devin. A 30% equity position in a financial institution is a controlling interest. The bank is privately held, which is why the ownership never surfaced in any public filing. But it has been there for 6 years. Your father has been a majority stakeholder in the firm, where you work for, according to my attorney's records, the past 6 years. He tilted his head slightly. The same 6 years during which you have described him to my family as being at various points in shipping a consultant, and on Christmas Day someone whose occupation you'd prefer not to bring up in company. Devin opened his mouth, closed it. Sylvia, in the chair near the window, had gone completely still. She was watching her future son-in-law with the expression of a woman revising something she had already settled in her mind, which in Paige's experience was among the more consequential expressions her mother was capable of. "There is one more thing," Philip said. His voice had not risen once. "My attorney also flagged a series of monthly transfers from a personal account registered to Vernon Hartley to an account registered to you. $3,500 per month, continuous going back approximately 4 years. He held Devin's gaze with the unhurried patience of a man who has nowhere else to be. "How much does your father send you each month, son?" The word son landed differently than any previous time Philip had used it. Devin's jaw went tight. His hands, which had been resting loose on his knees, pressed flat against his thighs. His chest lifted with a breath taken too deliberately, the breath of someone reaching for extra seconds. "He helps out sometimes," Devin said. "It's a family thing. $168,000 over 4 years. Philip said, "Is not sometimes?" Paige stood up. She did it quietly without signaling it to anyone, the way she does most things she can't take back. She lifted her phone from the cushion beside her and moved toward the hallway. She didn't look at Devin as she went past. She told me later she was afraid that if she did, something would come out that she wasn't ready to say. And she has always held back until she is sure, which is a quality I recognized the first time I saw it, because Loretta had it too. At the entrance to the hall, she paused. "Dad," she said, her back still to the room. "I'm going to take a walk." "Okay, sweetheart," Philip said. She left. The front door opened and closed with a sound so unremarkable it was almost a shock, a latch clicking into a frame, the most ordinary sound there is. And yet, in that room at that moment, it landed like a period at the end of a sentence nobody had realized was being written until it was already done. Devin kept his eyes on the door for a long moment after it shut. Then he looked at Philip, then at Sylvia. Sylvia looked back at him with the same expression she'd worn since Philip returned from the other room, the expression of a woman who has updated her position and is waiting without particular warmth to see what comes next. "I think," Devin said, choosing each word, "I should call my father." "I think," Philip said, settling back into his chair with the ease of a man who has finished deciding something and has nothing left to manage, "that is probably a good idea." He picked up his tablet. He did not look at Devin again. The television was still running. The ceremony in Concord had given way to the regular evening news. The anchor was on to something else entirely, the world moving on without ceremony the way it always does, indifferent to the weight of the rooms it passes through. 3 things happened within the hour after the broadcast ended. I think of them as the 3 doors. Because once a door opens, you can't will it back to being a wall. You can only choose what to do about the corridor it reveals. The first door was Cynthia Wexler. Cynthia had been a staff writer at the Boston Herald for 14 years. The last 2 spent constructing a series she called The Invisible Infrastructure of New York City. The companies and the people who kept the largest urban system in the country running without recognition, without ceremony, and without the kind of coverage reserved for tech startups or celebrity philanthropy. She had interviewed sanitation supervisors and tunnel maintenance crews and overnight food distributors. She had been watching Hartley Environmental since the Massport contract, because she grasped with the instinct of a seasoned reporter that a company operating at our scale without a single news story to its name was either exceptionally good at its work or exceptionally good at staying invisible. She wanted to find out which. She had filed the piece at 3 in the afternoon, time to post, the moment the ceremony concluded. The article ran under the headline, "The Man Who Cleaned Up Christmas Eve and Why You Never Heard of Him." 4,000 words. 30 years of Hartley Environmental. The Massport contract. The Christmas Eve response. The zero charge. It quoted Dr. Paula Renner. It quoted Carlos Vega. It quoted 3 of the 812 workers who had been standing in that parking structure on Christmas Eve, all of whom gave their names willingly because they wanted the record to exist. At the bottom of the piece, in a section Cynthia had headed Family Context, she included the GoFundMe page. She had turned it up 6 weeks earlier through a routine search of fundraising platforms using my name. She had documented the page, the photographs, the description, the $47,000 raised, and the date the funds were moved. She had contacted GoFundMe's fraud investigation team, which had been running its own inquiry since a donor flagged irregularities in the campaign 3 weeks prior. GoFundMe confirmed to Cynthia on the record that the campaign had been suspended, the account frozen, and the process of returning donations to contributors had begun that afternoon, timed, though Cynthia had no way of knowing this to the same hour the ceremony aired. The article did not name Devin. Cynthia is a careful reporter. She understood the legal distinction between public figures and private individuals, that naming someone without documented proof of their involvement creates significant exposure for the publication. Cynthia had documented proof. She simply chose not to deploy it yet. She described the campaign as having been created by a family member and left the rest to the reader's arithmetic, which in the age of the internet takes roughly 4 minutes. By 9 that evening, Devin's name was appearing in the comments on the Herald article. By 10, it had spread to 3 separate social media platforms. By 11, Cynthia had updated the piece with a note that the individual responsible had been identified by members of the public, and that the Herald was continuing to report. I was not watching any of this unfold. I am telling you what I learned later from Cynthia herself when she called me 2 days after. Professional, precise sharing information she believed I had a right to hold before the story moved further. She asked whether I wished to comment. I told her the article spoke for itself. She said she understood. It was a short call and a respectful one. The second door opened at 9:17. Sylvia Aldrich was alone in the living room. Philip had gone to his study. Devin had retreated to the guest room to make calls, and she had decided to look through the photographs she'd taken at Christmas dinner 2 nights earlier. She was searching for the shot of the centerpiece which she had promised to forward to her friend Carol, who was redoing her dining room. She found it. She airdropped it to her camera roll. She also, without registering that she had done so, airdropped a screenshot of her messages, screen captured at the same moment, which showed the top of the family group chat, which showed the last visible message, which was something Devin had sent 3 weeks prior. The message read, "Don't worry about my dad. He basically hauls trash for a living. I'll make sure he stays home for Christmas." Sylvia fired off the centerpiece photo to Carol. Then the screenshot went to Paige. It wasn't until 40 seconds had passed that she registered she'd sent them in the wrong order, and by then, Paige was already standing in the living room doorway, phone in hand, her expression carrying that particular controlled blankness of someone who has already arrived at a decision and is now simply locating the language for what she's already settled on. Mom, Paige said. Calm the way calm has to be worked at. "Did you mean to send me this?" Sylvia lifted the phone from her daughter's grip. Her eyes moved across the screenshot. She read it through once. That kind of reading where comprehension is instant, and the second time through is just verification. "No," Sylvia said, her words barely audible. "I did not." Paige held her gaze for a beat. Then came one slow nod. Not surprise. The nod of a person confirming what they had already known and simply needed to have spoken into the open. She turned and went back upstairs without a word, her steps on the stairs measured and unhurried, each one landing evenly until she reached the top. Paige told me later that Sylvia remained in that living room alone for a long stretch afterward. When Paige came down again an hour later for water, her mother hadn't moved, still in the same chair, still gripping the phone, and the photo of the centerpiece had never found its way to Carol. There are certain mistakes whose full consequence you feel the moment you make them. Sylvia Aldrich is not a careless woman. She knew exactly what she'd done in those 40 seconds before Paige ever set foot in the doorway. The third door swung open at 11:04. Cynthia Wexler published an embedded audio file alongside her Boston Herald piece, 43 seconds of recording. As the article laid out, it had been obtained via a Freedom of Information Act request submitted to the Southern New Hampshire Environmental Response Agency, drawn from the publicly accessible incident file generated by the Christmas Eve response at the Aldrich Pharmaceutical Facility. Under the Freedom of Information Act, which governs records held by government bodies at both the federal and state level, materials filed in connection with an official environmental incident become part of the public record the moment that incident is formally closed. The Southern New Hampshire agency had closed the Project Orchard file on December 26th. Cynthia had put in her request that same day. The audio itself had been captured by the automatic dispatch logging system aboard a Hartley Environmental Services response vehicle equipment that records all sound during active emergency deployment, as mandated by federal operational liability standards. New York State is a one-party consent jurisdiction, which means a recording is lawful so long as one participant in the conversation is aware of it and consents. Vernon Hartley, as owner of the vehicle and the party present on the call, satisfied that requirement. The recording was obtained lawfully. Its release was shielded by the First Amendment. What it contained was a phone call from the evening of December 24th. Devin's voice was clear on the playback. Behind it, road noise, the low thrum of a truck engine at highway speed. And then those words, the same ones I'd already heard delivered once, lived through a phone pressed to my ear while Hank held his gaze on the I-90 expressway and his jaw moved almost imperceptibly to the left. Dad, seriously, don't embarrass me. Don't show up, don't call, don't text Paige's family. Just disappear for one night, okay? You're good at that. 43 seconds. By midnight, you're good at that had climbed to the top trending phrase across social media in New York. By 12:30, it had gone national. By 1 in the morning, 3 network morning programs had reached out to license the recording for broadcast the next day. By 2, the comment thread beneath the Boston Herald story had broken 4,000 replies and the phrase had been converted into a hashtag, a meme template and a caption dropped beneath a photograph of my company trucks that someone had dug up from a logistics trade site and shared with the words, "This man drove out on Christmas Eve to help strangers. His son told him to disappear." None of that was visible to me. I was in the back seat of Hank's truck riding home from Concord, my jacket folded beside me on the seat and Loretta's handkerchief in my right hand, watching the glow of highway lights push past in the dark, same as they had 3 nights ago, when all of this set itself in motion. 3 days, what felt like 30 years. My phone kept ringing. I checked the screen. 8 calls from numbers I had no name for, and 2 from numbers I did. I laid the phone face down against my knee. Hank didn't say a word. Both hands on the wheel, eyes forward. That's how he's always driven. That's how he'll drive until he can't anymore. And I hope that day is a long way off. There are nights when the job is simply finished and the only right thing to do is let the world settle into whatever pace it needs. I held Loretta's handkerchief and let the dark roll by. On the morning of December 28th, my son placed 4 calls. I picked up for one. The first went to Paige at 7:43. She let it ring. She was at the kitchen table inside the Aldrich apartment laptop, opened the Boston Herald article pulled up on the screen, working through it a second time, not hunting for anything new, but pressing down on what she already knew to make sure it held. She'd been up since 5. She'd read it through at midnight, gone to bed, spent 2 hours staring at the ceiling, and risen again at 5 because the ceiling had given her nothing useful. She doesn't find waiting productive. She told me all of this afterward, recounted it in that precise, sequential way I've come to recognize as simply how Paige Aldrich takes in the world. No embellishment, no spiraling. She lines the facts up in front of her, and she moves. That's a quality I identified the first time anyone described her to me, and I've come to understand it's the thing that will take her wherever she chooses to go. When Devin's name appeared on her screen at 7:43, she stared at it for 5 full seconds. Then she placed the phone face down and returned to the article. The second call landed at 8:05 Philip's number. Philip answered. From down the hall, Paige caught the sound of her father's voice through the study door, quiet, and measured the register he shifts into when a situation demands precision over force. She couldn't make out the actual words. The call ran 6 minutes. The study door stayed shut when it ended. The third call went to a number Paige didn't have saved. She found out later it belonged to a PR consultant Devin had hired on 2 previous occasions to manage small reputational flare-ups at the bank. That call ran 22 minutes. Whatever came out of it amounted to nothing visible, no statement, no retraction, and the Boston Herald article sat exactly where Cynthia Wexler had left it, word for word, unchanged. The fourth call came to me. I'd been at the warehouse since 7:30. Eddie had phoned the previous evening to let me know the morning crew was heading in early to stage the first Aldrich Pharmaceutical delivery, the opening run under our new long-term contract. I wanted to be there, not to mark the occasion with any kind of ceremony, but because first things matter to me, and I'm not built to hand off something that matters and then receive a summary about it later. Eddie had taken care of breakfast, a folding table in the break room, loaded up with coffee from the diner on McGrath Highway, breakfast burritos in foil wrappers, and a box of donuts that Carlos's daughter Mila had apparently made a point of supplying because Eddie said she'd concluded firmly that anyone who gets handed a government medal is owed donuts. I walked in to find 12 of my crew already around that table in their work jackets, burritos in hand at 7:30 on a December morning. The warmth of it caught me off guard. The sheer ordinariness of it, the fact of it, it did something to my chest I hadn't braced for. I was partway through my second cup when Devin's name lit up my screen. I looked at it. I thought about December 24th. The I-90 expressway under snow, Hank's jaw moving just slightly to the left. I thought about a cream-colored card, 4 sentences in careful handwriting, sent to a stranger. I thought about a GoFundMe page carrying Loretta's funeral photograph. I answered, "Dad." His voice was wound tight, the voice of a man who hasn't slept and can hear that it shows. "I need you to do something for me." "All right," I said. "Tell me what." "I need you to call Cynthia Wexler at the Boston Herald and tell her there was a misunderstanding, a family miscommunication, that the GoFundMe was something we'd talked about, that you knew about it, and that the whole thing got mischaracterized." He was talking fast, words pressed close together, the cadence of someone who has run through this in his head and wants to finish it before he can be interrupted. "If you put out a statement today before the morning shows, air the audio, I think we can get out in front of it. My PR guy says, if the principal party in the story clarifies the narrative, the story loses its legs." The break room was alive around me, the easy noise of people eating and talking through what the day would ask of them. Carlos was holding his phone up for Mila to see some video she'd requested, and Mila was laughing with the total physical commitment that 9-year-olds devote to laughter, leaned back in her chair, eyes shut, completely gone to it. "Devin," I said. "Dad, please. I know I made mistakes. I know the GoFundMe was wrong, all of it was wrong, I know that. But I need one thing from you right now, and I'm asking you straight. Not through anyone else. Me asking you directly." "Devin," I said again. He went quiet. "I'm sitting with my crew," I said. "We're having breakfast before the first delivery run under a contract that will move your future father-in-law's product across 6 states. There are breakfast burritos and there are donuts, because a 9-year-old determined that people who receive government medals are owed donuts, and she is not wrong." I looked over at Mila, who had pulled herself together and was now deliberating with great seriousness over which donut to take. "There's no room at this table for a false statement, son. I won't make one. Not for you, not for anyone." The silence that came back lasted a long time. "She's going to leave me," Devin said. Something had shifted in his voice. The rehearsed quality had dissolved, and what was left underneath was smaller, more exposed. The voice of a man who has burned through every managed response and arrived somewhere he has no map for. "Paige, she won't pick up." "I know," I said. "What do I do?" I looked out through the break room window at the yard where the first truck of the morning was being loaded up. The crew moving with the quiet competence of people who know their work and trust the men and women beside them. "That's not something I can answer for you," I said, "but I can tell you what I know. You don't solve this with a statement. You don't solve it with a consultant. The only way anything real gets fixed is slowly and honestly and without an audience." I paused. "If you want to start somewhere, start with Paige. Not to rescue the engagement, to apologize, because it's the true thing to do." Another silence fell. "And Devin," I said before he could speak, "the door here is open. It has always been open. That was never what stood between us. You know where I find me." I hung up. Eddie across the table was watching me with that look he gets when he's caught enough of one side of a conversation to reconstruct the whole of it. He didn't say a word. He just pushed the donut box across the table in my direction. I took one glazed Loretta's favorite, the one I always reach for without thinking and only notice afterward. Outside, the first truck rolled out through the gate and the day got underway. The email came in at 8:51 in the morning. Devin told me about it himself later during one of the conversations we've been building since January, the kind that are still working out what shape they want to take. He described reading it on his phone while he sat on the edge of the guest bed in the Aldrich apartment, still wearing the clothes from the night before, the same ones he'd had on all evening because he hadn't so much slept as stopped moving for a few hours and then started again. The email was from the bank's chief human resources officer, 4 paragraphs. It informed Devin that an emergency meeting of the board of directors had been convened the previous evening, prompted by information that had entered the public record through news coverage and social media. The board had determined that his conduct constituted a violation of Section 4.2 of his employment agreement, which covered ethical standards and reputational obligations, and that his employment was terminated effective immediately. It detailed the severance terms, which were thin, because the termination was for cause. It directed him to arrange the return of his access badge and any company equipment within 5 business days. At-will employment in New York State means an employer can end the relationship at any time, for any reason or none, so long as the reason isn't discriminatory. When the reason is documented misconduct that has driven national news coverage and a trending hashtag, the legal risk of keeping the employee vastly exceeds any weight given to loyalty or length of service. The board hadn't required Vernon's direction. All they'd needed was a Tuesday morning and a copy of the Boston Herald. Devin sat on the edge of that guest bed and read the email 3 times. Then he called Paige again. She didn't answer. He stayed there another 20 minutes. Then he got up, put on his coat, and walked out of the Aldrich apartment for the last time. He rode the elevator to the lobby, moved past the doorman who had known him by name for 8 months, and stepped out onto Commonwealth Avenue into a gray December morning. He took the subway to Somerville. He told me later he hadn't planned to go there. He'd walked down to the Lexington Avenue station, intending to swing by the bank, collect his things, keep it practical and procedural. And somewhere between the turnstile and the platform, he boarded the wrong train, or perhaps the right one, and rode it all the way to the Somerville, Massachusetts stop, which puts you 6 blocks from my yard. I wasn't there when he showed up. I was over at the Massport Depot running a compliance review with Gloria, a quarterly requirement I'd already pushed back twice and couldn't reasonably delay again. Eddie called me at 11:23 to say Devin was in the lobby. He asked for me, I said. He asked if you were in. Eddie said. I told him you were off-site at a meeting. I said he was welcome to wait. Okay, I said. Vernon, Eddie said. He's been sitting there for 40 minutes. I know, I said. Let him sit. A pause on Eddie's end. Not the pause of a man who objects, but the pause of a man who understands and is turning over whether to say so out loud. He decided against it. That, too, is something you learn over 17 years. I finished the compliance review. I didn't rush it. Devin sat in the lobby of Hartley Environmental Services for 2 hours and 14 minutes. I know this because Hank, who runs the front security desk on Tuesday mornings, timed it. Hank times things. A habit carried over from his years behind the wheel, driving long haul when every minute on or off schedule rippled down the line to somebody. He reported it to me that evening with the economy of a man who deals in facts, 2 hours 14 minutes. No calls made. 1 cup of coffee accepted from Gloria's assistant. 1 trip to the water fountain. What Devin took in during those 2 hours and 14 minutes, I can only piece together from what he described later and from knowing that lobby the way I know it, because I built it and I walk through it every single day. He would have seen the safety record board first. It runs the length of the left wall as you enter 41 months without a lost time injury each month, marked by a green tile bearing the date and the crew lead's initials. It's what my eyes go to every morning when I arrive, and every evening before I leave. It represents something truer than any contract or revenue number. It's my actual measure of how we're doing. Across from the reception desk, he would have seen the photograph wall. 30 years of crews, the early ones shot in fading color, with Loretta visible here and there at the edges of the frame. The later ones in sharp digital clarity, faces he wouldn't know, but every one of which I could name without glancing at a caption, because I carry the memory of where each photograph was taken, what the job was, what the sky looked like, whether we wrapped on schedule. He would have seen Carlos's commendation from the State Department of Environmental Conservation, mounted in a frame near the hallway, awarded 2 years ago, for his management of a fuel spill in the Mystic River. He would have seen the Massport Partnership plaque. He would have seen the framed original of the first contract Hartley Environmental ever signed. 1-page hand-typed, dated 30 years ago, with Loretta's signature beside mine at the bottom. Gloria told me later that at some point during those 2 hours, Devin rose from his seat and stood in front of that first contract for a long stretch. She had a line of sight to him from her office window. He stood with both hands in his coat pockets, head tilted slightly forward, the posture of a man reading something he is taking his time with. She said he stayed there for 11 minutes. Then he sat back down. When I came back to the yard at 2 in the afternoon, Eddie was waiting for me at the gate. He left about an hour ago, Eddie said. Did he say anything, I asked? Eddie thought it over. He said to tell you he was sorry. Not about anything specific. He paused. Just sorry. I nodded. Is that enough? Eddie asked. I looked toward the lobby door, the safety board visible through the glass, the green tiles running left to right in their unbroken line. It's a beginning, I said. A beginning is enough to work from. I went inside. There was work waiting as there always is. The last thing I came to know was the one I wish I could carry differently. Not because it altered anything I already understood to be true, or any decision I'd already arrived at, or the door I had told Devin would always be open. It changed none of those things, but certain facts settle into you at a different depth than others. They locate the places you believed were already filled and press further into them. The Glassdoor reviews were that kind of fact for me. Eddie brought the file at 4 in the afternoon. He placed it on my desk without preface. The way he delivers things, he takes no pleasure in delivering, directly without softening the edges. Because Eddie has always known that wrapping a hard thing in too much cushioning distorts it, and then the thing you're confronting is no longer the actual thing. It's a more manageable version of it, and more manageable means less true. The file held 3 printed pages. Each was a screenshot of a Glassdoor review of Hartley Environmental Services. 1 star. Each posted on the same date 8 weeks prior. The reviews described the company as a hostile work environment. They described me as erratic and intimidating. They described our safety protocols as inadequate, and it was that specific word that had prompted our IT manager to flag the posts for legal review, because inadequate safety protocols is not a matter of opinion. It is a factual claim about documented standards, and our documented standards are among the most rigorously maintained in the state, reviewed quarterly by an independent auditor, and on file with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Conservation. At the bottom of each screenshot, our IT manager had added a single line. The IP address of origin on all 3 reviews was identical. It matched the Wi-Fi network registered to my home address in Somerville, Massachusetts. The timestamps placed the reviews on a weekend in October when Devin had come to stay at the house. He had slept in his childhood bedroom. I had made pancakes on Sunday morning. He had eaten them at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand the way he always does, and I hadn't thought anything of it the way I never do, because I have always assumed the best about the people I love, until the evidence makes that assumption impossible to hold. I read the file once, then set it in the center of the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then I said to Eddie, "File it with the attorneys. Standard defamation protocol. Let them handle the process." Eddie nodded. He picked up the file. He did not move toward the door. "You okay?" he said. It is a question Eddie almost never asks. He understands better than most that I am okay in the structural sense nearly all of the time that the machinery keeps running, that I show up and do the work, regardless of what is happening below the surface. So, when he does ask, it isn't casual. It means he has caught something in my face that worries him enough to name it. "I made pancakes," I said. Eddie looked at me. "The morning he posted those reviews," I said. "He stayed the weekend. I made pancakes Sunday morning. He sat at the kitchen table and ate them. And then he posted 3 reviews calling me a hostile and erratic employer." I looked toward the window. The yard sat quiet in the late afternoon light. The trucks stood in their rows along the fence, the Hartley Environmental logo on each one visible from where I was. I keep looking for the version of that story that makes sense. I haven't found it. Eddie sat down across from my desk, which he rarely does. He is someone who handles most of his business on his feet. Loretta told me something once. He said, when Devin was maybe 15, 16, she said, "Loving a child is the only kind of loving where you go all the way in before you know who they're going to be. You're already completely there before they become themselves." He leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. She said, "The hard part isn't falling in love with them. The hard part is figuring out what you do when the person they become is not the person you fell in love with." I sat with that for a while. Outside, the late afternoon light was going gray over Somerville, the particular gray of a December afternoon that has used up everything it had. A pigeon was making its way along the top of the fence with the self-important purposefulness of a pigeon that has somewhere to be. 2 of my drivers were talking near the gate, one of them moving a coffee cup through the air to make some point the other found funny. I watched them without really taking them in. "I don't know how to stop loving him," I said after a while. "I don't think I'm wired for that." "No," Eddie said. "You're not. But I'm done acting like he's someone he hasn't shown me he is yet," I said. "Those are 2 separate things, and I had them tangled up together for a long time." Eddie nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "they are." We stayed like that for a few minutes, the 2 of us in the quiet office gray light through the window, the sound of the drivers laughing carrying in from outside, the kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that holds everything that belongs there and leaves out what doesn't. Gloria knocked once and came through the door. "This came by courier," she said. She was holding a cream-colored envelope, heavy stock, with a wax seal pressed into the flap. She set it on the desk in front of me. Return address is Aldrich Pharmaceutical Group. Philip Aldrich, personal. She left without waiting to see me open it. I broke the seal. Inside was a single card, the kind of paper whose weight tells you something before you read a word. Philip's handwriting was precise and unhurried. The hand of a man who writes by hand because he means what goes on the page and wants the effort to be part of the message. The card read, "We are hosting our annual partners reception on New Year's Eve at the Aldrich Building on Boylston Street. We would be honored if you would join us. There is someone I would like to introduce you to. Please bring your team. They have earned a good table." It was signed Philip Aldrich, and below the signature in ink that looked slightly different, as though it had been added once the rest was already written. My daughter will be there in a professional capacity. She asked me to include that. I read the card twice. Then I placed it on the desk alongside the glass door file, 2 pieces of paper side by side. I looked at them together for a moment, what my son had done in the dark and the invitation from a man who had seen what was done in the light. I took out Loretta's handkerchief. I held it in both hands the way I do when I need to think straight. Then I lifted the card and slipped it into my breast pocket. I had a party to attend. And for the first time in longer than I could easily say, I was walking into it as exactly who I am, and nothing more than that. The Aldrich Building on Boylston Street has a lobby engineered to project permanence. Marble floors, brass fixtures, elevator doors, that part quietly, and seal themselves the same way as though the machinery itself has been taught that in this building, things get done without excess noise. Philip Aldrich's company has held the top 3 floors for 22 years, long enough that the building and the company have grown into each other. And by now, you can't cleanly tell where one ends and the other begins. I've walked through a great many buildings over the course of my career. Some smell like money, some smell like work. The ones built to last almost always carry both at once. Stepping off the elevator onto the 31st floor of the Aldrich Building on New Year's Eve, I caught both. Eddie was beside me. Carlos was just behind us, with Mila on his left and his wife Elena on his right, the 2 of them dressed as though the evening called for it, because it did. Hank was at the back in a sport coat I hadn't laid eyes on before, jaw at its usual composed angle, but his eyes moving carefully over the room the way they do when he's reading a new place. Gloria was beside Hank, wearing the earrings she keeps for occasions that mean something. The room was already well populated. The Aldrich Pharmaceutical Partners reception had been running for 30 years, and the crowd reflected it at people who had attended long enough to know which appetizers were worth positioning yourself near, and which conversations to step into and which to steer around. Around 80 guests, maybe. Along the south wall, floor-to-ceiling windows opened up the city below, the lights of Boston spreading out in every direction, and in a few hours they'd be joined by the specific brightness of a city crossing into a new year. Philip found me within 2 minutes of walking in. He cut across the room with the decisiveness of a man who has made up his mind and is following through on it, and he shook my hand the way he'd shaken it outside the southern New Hampshire facility at 2:00 in the morning on Christmas Eve. Same grip, same duration, same steadiness. "Vernon," he said, "I'm glad you came." "Thank you for the invitation," I said. "Your building smells like work." He studied me for a moment. Then he laughed, a real one, the kind that doesn't come with any preamble. "My father built it that way deliberately," he said. He said, "Any building that only smells like money eventually runs out of both." He brought me around to people I hadn't met, buyers, distributors, logistics partners from across the region. And in every introduction, he said the same thing in different words, that Hartley Environmental had saved his most critical facility on Christmas Eve, and that he intended to say so in every room available to him. A man named Stu, a buyer from a regional grocery chain, gripped my hand and told me he had watched the Boston Herald piece 3 times and sent it to his entire management team. A woman from Aldrich's Southern New Hampshire Distribution Center had been on the Christmas Eve shift and had been among the 812 in the parking structure. She found me near the bar and said, "Thank you," in a way that needed nothing added to it. I said, "You're welcome," in a way I hope carried the same weight. Carlos was deep in conversation with 2 of Aldrich's warehouse managers over by the windows, and I could see from across the room what Carlos does in those moments, talking with his full body, hands in motion, head tilted forward, the posture of a man entirely at ease with what he knows and genuinely glad to pass it along. Mila was beside him with a glass of sparkling cider, following the conversation with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who has concluded this is an important evening and means to hold on to it. She will hold on to it. I have no doubt of that. Paige arrived at 8:15. She came through the door with a slim leather portfolio under her arm and the measured forward momentum of someone present in a professional capacity who understands precisely what that entails. She greeted her father with a quick kiss on the cheek. She shook my hand with both of hers and held it a beat longer than the occasion required, which said to me everything I needed to understand about where she was in deciding what her next chapter looked like. "My father speaks very highly of you," she said. "He's been generous," I said. She said there's a difference. We executed the contract at a small table near the windows, Paige representing Aldrich Pharmaceutical Group and Eddie representing Hartley Environmental, with Philip and me as witnesses on our respective sides. It was a 5-year agreement covering cold chain logistics across Aldrich's entire Northeast distribution network, the largest contract in Hartley Environmental's history, by a margin wide enough that Gloria's eyes went briefly wet when she reviewed the terms which she disputes. After the signing, Philip stood and raised his glass to the room. He thanked the people who had been with them for 30 years. He thanked the people who had come to them this year. He said the measure of a real partnership was not the contract itself, but the conduct behind it. Not what people commit to do, but what they actually do when it's difficult and inconvenient and no one is looking. He raised his glass in my direction. "To the people who show up," he said, "and to the ones who show up on Christmas Eve." The room lifted their glasses. I thought about Loretta's kitchen table on Sunday nights. I thought about the first time Hank backed a truck into a dock and got it square on the opening, trying the look he shot me to see whether I'd caught it, and I had. I thought about Carlos in full protective equipment at 6 times permissible exposure, steady and methodical, and about Mila in the second row in Concord with her notebook, open writing things down, because she'd decided they were worth keeping. I reached into my pocket for Loretta's handkerchief, not to use it, just to hold it the way I've held it at every moment that has mattered to me for 6 years. The way a man holds something that reminds him where he came from and what it cost, and why it was worth every bit of it. At 9:45, Eddie touched my arm. "Outside," he said quietly by the elevator. I knew before I looked. I moved through the room and out the door into the corridor, and Devin was standing by the elevator in his good coat, both hands at his sides, not performing anything. Not running any prepared script, just standing there, the way a person stands when they've exhausted every strategy and arrived somewhere more honest. He looked at me. I looked at him. He didn't speak, and neither did I. And this time the silence between us wasn't hollow. It had 2 people in it who had known each other a long time and were slowly finding their way back to something that was true. "I don't know how to start," he said at last. "You already did," I said. "In the lobby, 2 hours and 14 minutes. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen there in a very long time. I held the door open. "Come in," I said. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He stepped through. The room flowed on around us the way rooms do when life returns to them, warm and ordinary and entirely enough. And the year closed the only way a year worth living can close, with the people who matter, in a room that smells like work at a table, where everyone present is exactly who they are. That is where the story lands. Not with a courtroom, not with a confrontation made for an audience, just a door held open and a son walking through it and a room full of people who showed up when it counted. I have thought about what this cost more times than I can number. It cost me years of assuming the best, when the evidence was pointing elsewhere. It cost me a version of my son I had been carrying in my mind long after he had already moved on from it. I believe God does not waste the hard things that they are given to us precisely because we are able to carry them, and because what grows on the other side of them could not have grown any other way. If these father stories have taught me anything, it is this. Don't confuse loyalty with blindness. You can love someone completely and still require them to be honest with you. The work you do in the dark honestly without an audience is always the work that defines you. Let it be the kind you can stand behind. When someone shows you who they are, believe the showing, not the version you built before you knew, and keep the door open, not because they deserve it, because you are the kind of person who does. These grandpa revenge stories are not really about settling scores. They are about a man refusing to disappear and discovering slowly that the people worth keeping had been watching all along. If this story reached something in you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge so the next story finds you, thank you for being here. Take care of yourself and I'll see you in the next one.